Hello, my name is Mikko, and in this two-part series I'm going to show you how to make 3D game assets with the high to low poly baking workflow. First I'm showing you the overview of the process, and then I'll talk about how does this workflow fit into the larger context of 3D game art. Then in part 2 I will show you the process in more detail with modeling this hammer. The process goes something like this. First is making the detailed high poly version of your model. In this step we want to focus on the quality of the shapes, make curved surfaces smooth and edged bevel to catch the light. There's no limit on poly count, you can go as high as possible as long as your software doesn't crash. Find a balance on what details you have to do with modeling. A lot of the surface details like scratches and so on can be done with texturing. There are many ways of creating the high poly model, like sculpting, sub-D modeling or even CAD modeling. Some of the methods can be easier depending on the model. For example, organic shapes like rocks and so on are usually done with sculpting. The next step is making the low poly model. This is the optimized version that will be used in the game. It is usually made on top of the high poly model in a process called retopology. The focus is on trying to match the silhouette of the high poly model with limiting the amount of polygons. You can usually make this process faster with reusing some of the parts of the high poly model. After that comes UV unwrapping. This is the process of unfolding the low poly model to a flat plane so we can apply textures to it. With the high poly, low poly and the UVs done, it's time for baking. This is the step where we transfer the details from the high poly model to the low poly model as textures. These baked texture maps are used as a base for the next step, which is texturing. This is probably the most important part in the process for a good end result. It's where we create the surface quality of the model, things like color, roughness and surface details like scratches. So these are the general steps for making 3D game models with the high to low poly baking workflow. But not all game assets are made in the same way. The workflow that I showed you is a good chunk of knowledge that is useful for creating all sorts of small to medium sized assets like weapons, vehicles, props and some environment assets. But it's only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to 3D game art. There are a lot of different styles and use cases that require a different approach for making the models. World of Warcraft and League of Legends, for example, have hand-painted models where a lot of the lighting is painted into the base color. Then you have low poly models where you can see the individual polygons, like in Deep Rock Galactic, and models that have simple colors with flat lighting, like in the Untitled Goose Game. The high to low poly workflow that I showed you is good for games where you need more detail and light interaction with the models. Games like Cyberpunk 2077, Assassin's Creed or stylized games like Fortnite or Overwatch. It's good for all sorts of different models. But there are cases even in the same game project when this workflow is not suitable and you need to apply some other method for creating the models. For example, if you need to make huge assets like big ruins or large cliffs, or want to reuse detail from one texture to multiple objects, you need some other tricks to your tool belt of 3D asset creation. But I think the high to low poly workflow is a good baseline to know, because almost all of these other methods have some of the same steps in their process as well. In part 2, that will be released sometime in the near future, I will go over the workflow in more detail with making this hammer in Blender and Substance Painter.